Hello everyone, welcome to this YouTube live session on Phillips curve, inflation unemployment trade-off, organized by Crack Economics and Statistics. This is Atman Shah. I teach economics at St. Xavier's College, Ahmedabad, India. You can reach us on this given email ID crack.eco.stat@gmail.com. You can find the videos on economics, statistics, and SPSS on our YouTube channel. So if you are interested in these areas, you can visit our YouTube channel and watch the videos. So today we are going to discuss the Phillips curve, which describes the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. So at the beginning, I'm going to discuss the history of Phillips curve. Then we are going to discuss the formal explanation of the Phillips curve with the help of the diagram. And at the end of the session, I'm going to discuss the sacrifice ratio. The relationship between inflation and unemployment plays an important role in the policy making, particularly in macroeconomics. So policymakers are always try to reduce the inflation and unemployment in a particular economy. So this inflation and unemployment are always at the focus of the policymakers. They always try to target these two variables. The relationship between these two variables was first studied by Irving Fisher in 1920, and then it was further developed by British economist A.W. Phillips in his article published in 1958. He studied the history of UK for the period of 1861 and 1957 in his article, The Relationship Between Unemployment and Rate of Changes of Money Wage Rates in the United Kingdom from 1861 to 1957, which was published in Economica Journal. So he studied the relationship between inflation and unemployment for the period of 1861 to 1957 for UK. And he finds that these two variables, these two things, inflation and unemployment, are inversely related with each other. So there is inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. So when we say there is inverse relationship, this implies the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Now, what do we mean by trade-off? So if the policymaker wants to reduce the inflation, he or she has to pay the cost in terms of higher inflation, higher unemployment. So if policymakers wants to reduce the inflation, he has to pay the cost in terms of higher unemployment. And if policy maker wants to reduce the unemployment, they have to pay the price in terms of inflation. So this shows that the policymaker cannot decrease or cannot reduce the inflation and unemployment simultaneously in the economy. If they want to reduce the inflation, they have to pay the price in terms of higher unemployment. And if they want to reduce the unemployment, they have to pay the price in terms of higher inflation. So according to Phillips, the inflation rate depends on the three things. First, expected inflation. Second, the deviation of unemployment from the natural rate of unemployment, which is also known as cyclical unemployment. And third, supply shock. So according to Phillips, these three variables affect the inflation rate in the economy. Or in other words, we can say that inflation rate depends on these three things. So let's understand the mathematical expression of the Phillips curve. So here we have this equation, which is known as the Phillips curve equation. Here pi is inflation. This is inflation. Pi e is the expected inflation. So we have seen that inflation depends on three things. First is expected inflation, that is pi e. Second is the cyclical unemployment, that is the deviation of employment from its natural rate. So this UN is the natural rate. This U minus UN is the deviation from the natural rate of unemployment. So that shows the cyclical unemployment, that is U minus UN. Beta is the coefficient which shows the response of inflation to the cyclical unemployment. So if cyclical unemployment changes by 1 unit, the changes in inflation is expressed by beta. And V is the supply shock. So this is the idea, or this is the mathematical expression of the Phillips curve. With this equation, we can explain the relationship between inflation and unemployment. Now you can see this minus sign before the beta coefficient, which means that this inflation pi and unemployment is inversely related. So there is trade-off between inflation and unemployment. This minus sign shows that there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Let's understand it with the help of the diagram. So here we have unemployment on x-axis and inflation on y-axis. We know that there is inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. So we have this downward sloping Phillips curve, AB. Now there is a dilemma for policymakers. Choose higher unemployment with lower inflation. So for example, let's take this point. Point A. So suppose inflation is OF, the rate of inflation is OF and rate of unemployment is OG. Now suppose policymaker wants to reduce the inflation. So from OF to OH. Point B. So unemployment rate increases from OG to OJ, which means that if policymaker wants to reduce the inflation, he has to pay the price of higher unemployment. Similarly, if policymaker wants to reduce the unemployment, suppose policymaker reduce the unemployment from OJ to OG. So in that case, inflation rate increases from OH to OF. So they have to choose a particular combination of inflation and unemployment in the economy. They cannot reduce the unemployment and inflation simultaneously because there is a trade-off. Now the question is, why we have the trade-off? Why we have the inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment? What is the reason behind that? So let's understand the demand pull inflation and unemployment. So higher inflation, assume that there is higher inflation in the economy. So higher inflation means higher profits, and higher profits give incentive to increase the production. So if production increases in the economy, that decreases the unemployment. So higher money wage rates leads to demand pull inflation, and demand pull inflation reduces the unemployment rate because this demand pull inflation increases the profits, and profits lead to more production in the economy, which in turn reduces the unemployment. So therefore, we have this trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So if we have higher inflation in the form of demand pool inflation, we have the lower unemployment. Now keep in mind that this process is rapid and quick. Let's talk about the recession. So during recession, inflation rate is low, so profits are lower, which basically explains the lower profit. So in case of lower profits, or when the profits are decreasing in the economy, there is a decrease in the demand for labor. So firms lay off employees, so which increases the unemployment. So here this lower inflation rate increases the unemployment in the economy. So therefore again we have the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And this process is slow. What are the implications? First, the upward movement in wage rate is very quick. So the upward pressure on the wage rate is very quick, but the downward pressure in the wage rate is low. Now let's talk about the wage push inflation and unemployment. Normally we have two types of inflation, demand pull and cost push. So this wage push is a part of the cost push inflation. So lower unemployment rate basically shows the higher profits in the economy. So higher profits or lower unemployment rate means that the labor unions have the higher power to get the higher wages. Their bargaining power increases if the unemployment rate is lower in the market. So higher wages increases the production cost, and the increase in the production cost increases the price level, which basically shows the inflation. So again, this lower unemployment rate is associated with the higher inflation. So we have the trade-off. Now, if unemployment rate is high in the economy, which shows the lower profits. So if unemployment rate is high, labor unions do not have the power to get higher wages, because many unemployed workers are ready to work at lower wage rate. So that reduces the power of the labor unions. So therefore, the higher unemployment rate reduces the wage, which shows the deflation. So this higher unemployment rate is associated with the deflation. So again, we have the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So this idea behind the inverse relationship is very important, and that can be explained with the help of demand pull inflation and unemployment, and wage push inflation and unemployment. And the upward movement in the money wage is very quick and rapid, whereas the downward pressure on the wage rate is a slow process. Now let's understand the idea of sacrifice ratio. The sacrifice ratio is basically the quantification of the trade-off. So suppose policymakers decide to reduce the inflation. So this reduction in inflation means we have to pay the price in terms of higher unemployment, so that increases the unemployment, and an increment in the unemployment reduces the output. Now the question is, by how much and for how long? if policymakers decide to reduce the inflation, then we have to pay the price in terms of unemployment, but by how much and for how long we have to sacrifice the or by how much or for how long we have to increase, we have to compromise the unemployment rate. Similarly, by how much and for how long we have to sacrifice the loss in the output. So that idea is very important, because when we make the policies, we have to keep in mind the negative impact of higher unemployment and lower output when we are targeting the inflation rate. So sacrifice ratio is used to measure this phenomenon. So what is the definition of sacrifice ratio? The percentage of year's real GDP that must be foregone to reduce inflation by 1 percentage point. I'm repeating the definition. The percentage of year's real GDP that must be foregone to reduce the inflation by 1 percentage point. So if the policy makers reduce the inflation by 1 percentage point, and if the GDP ratio, or if the GDP declines by 4 percentage point, then the sacrifice ratio is 4. If GDP reduces by 3 percentage points, then sacrifice ratio is 3. Now, Ocon in 1978 actually estimated this sacrifice ratio, and the typical estimation is 5. Now, what does that mean? 1% reduction in inflation causes 5% reduction in GDP. That is output. When we say GDP, we are talking about the output. And 1% change in unemployment rate reduces 2% change in GDP. So here we can say that 1% reduction in inflation, if policy makers want to reduce the inflation rate by 1 percentage point, they have to bear, or they have to pay the cost of 2.5% reduction in unemployment. I'm repeating myself. If policy makers wants to reduce the inflation by 1 percentage point, they have to pay the price in terms of unemployment, and unemployment increases by 2.5 percentage points. So that is a trade-off. Either if you reduce the inflation by 1%, the unemployment rate increases by 2.5%. So suppose policymakers want to reduce the inflation rate by 2%. So in that case, the unemployment rate increases by 5%. If policymakers want to reduce the inflation by 4%, in that case, unemployment rate increases by 10%. So that is the sacrifice ratio. And that shows that when policymakers make the decision, or when policymakers target the variables when they make the policies for the economy, so if they target the inflation, they have to pay the price in terms of higher unemployment, and if they target the unemployment, they have to pay the price in terms of higher inflation. So there is always a trade-off between inflation and unemployment according to Phillips, and Ocon estimated this sacrifice ratio. So suppose policy makers reduce the inflation by 4%. Here if you see, if inflation rate reduces by 4%, they have to pay the price in terms of GDP, and GDP will be lost by 20 percentage points. If they reduces the unemployment by 1%, the GDP will increase by 2%. So that is the use of sacrifice ratio in the policy making. So today we talked about the idea of Phillips curve. the formal explanation of the Phillips curve with the help of the diagram, uh, which shows the negatively sloped Phillips curve, indicating the inverse relationship between between unemployment and inflation rate. So there is a trade-off. So we cannot reduce the unemployment and inflation rate simultaneously. If we want to reduce the unemployment rate, we have to pay the price in terms of higher inflation. And if we want to reduce the inflation rate, we have to pay the price in terms of higher unemployment rate. And at the end, we have discussed the idea of sacrifice ratio, which shows that how much uh, unemployment rate or GDP we must give up to reduce the inflation rate. So if you find this video useful, kindly like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Crack Economics and Statistics, and help us to grow. We have also created the WhatsApp group. So if you are interested, you can join our WhatsApp group, on which you get the messages regarding these YouTube live sessions and the link of the video immediately after completing the session. So thank you very much for joining us on this session.